欢迎来到我们的六度解析节目。今天我们要讨论的是欧洲议会选举的最新结果。这次选举中，极端势力的席次明显增加，尤其是极右和极左阵营，对德法等传统政坛势力造成了巨大冲击。选举结果还显示出，这些极端势力可能会成为习近平的朋友，进一步影响欧洲议会对中国的态度。这次选举结果是否意味着欧洲议会将向右转？这又将如何影响欧盟的未来政策？请大家继续收看详细内容。在经过4天的激烈角逐后，欧洲议会选举初步结果终于出炉。尽管中间派如预期般取得最多席次，但极右、极左势力的崛起却让传统政党的存亡成了一个大问号。这一波极端风不仅冲击了德国和法国的政坛，更令部分人担忧，欧洲议会或将成为更多习近平的朋友的乐园。这次选举的投票率约为 51%， 比往年稍微高点，但这数字背后的故事可谓波澜壮阔，充满惊奇。立场中间偏右的欧洲人民党依旧是席次最多的政党，拿下184席，而中间偏左的社会党与民主党进步联盟紧随其后，取得139席。这一结果对于现任欧盟委员会主席冯德莱恩来说，可谓是一场胜利之夜。他乐观地表示，今天对欧洲人民党团来说是好日子，朋友们，我们赢了。然而，这场选举并非只有老朋友的胜利，高达98个不隶属于任何党团的席次，极右民粹主义的认同与民主党团拿下的58席，以及德国极右翼的选项党等一众新势力，让整个欧洲政坛惊呼：这是什么新时代？德法政坛大震荡，极右势力和习大大成一对。选举结果一公布，德国和法国的政坛立刻地震级动荡。德国总理肖尔茨的社民党遭遇了史上最大的挫败，尴尬的连面子都挂不住。更有意思的是，尽管选项党议员克拉 Maximilian Kra 的华裔助理涉嫌替中国从事间谍活动，该党的得票率却神奇地高于社民党。这个现象不禁让人怀疑，难道德国选民是选票投给最具戏剧性的那一边吗？法国那边更热闹，总统马克龙率领的中间阵营频频受挫，最终他只好宣布解散法国国民议会，打算提前在6月底到7月初进行国会改选。这一举动让法国政坛变得宛如一场现实版权力的游戏，各方势力蓄势待发，准备一场大战。极端派的崛起，中国的影响力会扩大吗？这次选举结果不仅让人看到了中间派的疲态，也让极右势力的崛起浮出水面。这是否会对欧盟的对华态度产生影响？ DW 客座评论员张俊华在其8日的文章中指出，虽然极右派与极左派的意识形态天差地别，但在某些具体问题上，两者都意外的亲中。这种现象让人不禁好奇，欧洲议会是否会出现更多习近平的朋友？张俊华举例说，德国选项党议员克拉在其中国间谍丑闻爆发前，经常扮演中国代言人的角色，对中国的一带一路倡议和中俄在乌克兰战争中的立场都持支持态度。即便他因为这些争议声明而被迫退出选项党领导阶层，这并未影响到其所在党派的选举表现。普京和习近平的新朋友，位于匈牙利的分析机构政治资本研究所专家克雷科在欧洲新闻台上发表了一篇社论，标题可谓一针见血。我们将在新一届欧洲议会看到更多普京和习近平的朋友。这篇文章指出，中国和俄罗斯等专制独裁政权有望在欧洲取得更多破口，进一步影响欧洲的决策。该文分析指出，复兴欧洲党团对专制政权的批评最多，其次是欧洲人民党团、绿党和社民党团等，而对专制政权批评最少的，则是极右的认同与民主党团以及极左的左翼党团。前者对中国的批评甚少，后者则对中国和俄罗斯都持相对宽容的态度。欧洲议会从中间派到极端派的转变，这次选举结果也引起国际媒体的广泛关注。 许多人担心欧洲议会的右倾趋势会对欧盟未来的政策产生深远影响。路透社分析指出，若欧洲议会真的向右转，涉及欧洲安全、气候变迁以及中国和美国之间的产业竞争等议题的新法案过关，可能会更加困难。美联社则表示，极右派的崛起将让欧盟未来的移民、安全与气候政策面临更多变数。这些新势力的崛起可能改变欧洲的政治格局。后续发展，欧洲议会未来的走向。选举结束后，欧洲议会未来的走向成了人们关注的焦点。传统中间派是否能够重拾信心？绿党能否卷土重来？极右势力是否会成为新一届议会的主导力量，都是未知数。更值得关注的是，中国的影响力是否会在一场政治风暴中进一步扩大。总的来说，这次选举结果无疑让人看到了欧洲政治格局的变化，也让人感受到了极端势力崛起的威胁。未来的欧洲议会将如何应对这些挑战，只有时间能给出答案。在此之前，我们只能拭目以待，期待这场政治大戏的下一幕。天气晴朗的星期日，欧洲议会选举结果出炉。这个被形容为政治地震的选举日，带来了令人瞠目结舌的变化。在这片广袤的欧洲大地上，各国政坛如同地壳运动般巨变，右派势力风起云涌。中国鹰派的代表冯德莱恩带着一脸自信，象征性地将他的战靴擦亮，准备好在新任期内继续他那强硬的对华政策。这个来自德国的欧洲委员会主席见证了欧洲议会的一次右转，仿佛是一场诸侯割据的热闹戏码。这天晚上，布鲁塞尔的议会大厅里，媒体蜂拥而至，仿佛嗅到了新鲜的政治血腥味。冯德莱恩所属的中右派欧洲人民党 EPP 成为了这次选举的最大赢家，赢得了189个席位，比5年前增加了7个。这个结果让他的信心更加膨胀，仿佛他已经准备好戴上第2任的皇冠。对着煞有介事的媒体，他扬言要与中间派的社会主义及民主集团和 Renew 展开谈判，打造一个强大的欧洲。然而，法国总统马克龙却是他前进道路上的一块绊脚石。马克龙的中间派联盟在与极右翼国民联盟的对垒中惨败，这让他不得不解散国会，准备在6月底举行立法选举。这一举动使得他的影响力大打折扣，特别是在下周即将讨论冯德莱恩的候选资格时。当晚，马克龙阵营的领衔候选人瓦莱丽·海尔甚至连议会都没出现，留下了一群无助的记者。而与此同时，奥地利的极右翼自由党 FPO 也在这次选举中大获全胜，这是他们首次在全国范围内的投票中位居第一。根据计票结果，这个党派赢得了 25.7% 的选票，略高于执政的保守派人民党 24.7%。这样的结果让人不禁想起了意大利总理乔治亚·梅洛尼，他的极右翼政党意大利兄弟党在这次选举中赢得了压倒性的胜利。当选结果公布时，梅洛尼的脸上洋溢着胜利的笑容，仿佛他已经看到了未来的繁荣与光明。他甚至在社交媒体上发了一张自己比 V 字手势的照片，配文简单却意味深长：谢谢。意大利人民似乎对他的领导充满信心，他的政党获得了超过 28% 的选票，超过了去年9月国会选举时的 26%。梅洛尼将这次选举定位为对他领导力的公投，结果显然是让他感到无比自豪。在选举结果公布的那个凌晨2点，他对媒体说：“我为这个结果感到异常骄傲。”这话说的不无道理，因为他即将在普利亚主办 G7 领袖会议，这次胜利无疑让他的底气更足。相比之下，梅洛尼的盟友却没那么幸运。他的初级联合政府伙伴马泰奥·萨尔维尼的反移民联盟党支持率暴跌至不到 9%， 而在2019年，他们可是凭着 34% 的选票在欧洲议会选举中大获全胜。前总理朱塞佩·孔特5星运动 也是一片愁云惨雾，选票不足10%。梅洛尼本人也参加了这次选举，但他并不会真的去当欧洲议会议员，因为这与他的国内政治职位是互相矛盾的。在这样的政治氛围中，梅洛尼如何利用他在布鲁塞尔的影响力，成为了各界瞩目的焦点。他已经被冯德莱恩和勒庞双方争相拉拢，但他究竟会选择谁呢？这可是一场政治上的大戏。随着选举结果的公布，欧洲各国的政坛都在悄然变化。德国的极右翼政党另类选择也大获全胜，仅次于保守派基督教民主党。这些胜利者们似乎准备好要在欧洲议会中掀起一场翻天覆地的变革。冯德莱恩的鹰派政策会否继续施行，还是会被新势力所扼杀？一切都充满了不确定性。这个夜晚，布鲁塞尔的议会大厅灯火通明，记者们忙碌地敲打着键盘，政治分析家们则在猜测未来的走向。欧洲的政治版图正在重新划分，而冯德莱恩能否在这场风暴中继续掌舵，仍是一个悬而未决的问题。无论如何，这场政治大戏才刚刚开幕，而观众们已经迫不及待想知道接下来的剧情会如何发展。谢谢大家收看六度探索，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体。网友与六度 AI 参与合作，完成各种内容。这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6du.world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场啊！今天我们要聊中国人事变动的有关消息。今天一早啊，我就看到这个人社部的网站是发布了一条叫国家机关工作人员的任免信息，其中特别说任免邱勇为科技部的副部长，免去他之前在中国工程物理研究院副院长的职务。邱勇到底是谁呀？那我很快就查一查相关的资料，结果发现很不幸，这个名字呀对应的人太多了，有清华大学的这个校领导啊，有中国著名的某个医学专家，还有演员也叫邱勇。但是显然啊，都与我们说的这个邱勇啊，并不是同一个人。但是相反，这一次晋升为科技部副部长的这个邱勇啊，在公开的资料中见到的却非常的少。那么我们唯一知道的就是他在2013年是到了这个中物院，就是中国工程物理研究院当了研究员。之后他在中物院干了什么我们都不知道，就知道他在2020年就升任了中国工程物理研究院的副院长。也就是说，在6、7年之间，从一个刚刚入院的研究员到了整个如此重要的工程物理研究院的副院长，这个晋升的速度是非常快的。但是呢，他似乎很少在公开场合有露面，也不知道他的科研项目到底是怎样的，也不知道他本人到底是从事什么行业的研究的。这个事情就让我觉得有一点奇怪啊。当然，比他更神秘的可能是我们说的中国工程物理研究院。中国工程物理研究院其实呢是中国唯一的一个核武器的研制生产单位，还有一个听起来非常霸道的名字叫做九院听起来像武侠小说中的名字。那能不能请何密先生介绍一下这个中物院到底是一个什么样的机构？邱勇从这个机构里面出来，现在担任科技部的副部长，到底有怎样的深意和意义啊？
九院呢，这名字唱大了，其实最开始的名字叫九所，
对
主要是2大系统一个呢是总部在北京大家都知道北太平庄有时候有一些地方什么牌子都没有，但是站到一个中国人民解放军而不是武警，你就知道这是一个特别重要的地方。 但是它的一些主体的研究的地方呢，也分布在极的一些偏僻的地方，譬如说四川的岷阳，它也有一些基地譬如说这个马南，马南是中国第一个核武器的军事基地。那么这些事情讲起来都是国家机密但是我讲的东西大家都已经知道了，所以我在讲。我懂得的东西也只是了大家知道的东西。不过我要强调一点，由中国工程物理学院，就是原来的9所或者是9院，一个副院长当一个科技部的副部长，一点都没什么了不起的。因为9院就隐藏了一大批大家连名字都不知道。2大一星之后，大家都知道有一个叫郑稼先，对不对？实际上行内的人都知道，还有一个俞敏知名度或者重要性呢一点都不低大家都只知道钱学森是不是钱学森？钱学森，
对，钱学森
钱学森。工程学院就是应用物理那么物理我们知道有理论物理，有应用物理，应用物理其实就是终极物理就是研究核武器。研究了，但是核武器这个东西吧，在这个80年代一度是红得不得了。那个时候美国有2个科学家一个是叫李政道一个就是叫杨振宁，在中国各个地方招募中国最顶尖的、最聪明的这个研究物理的这些学生朋友。那有我的同学那个时候就有很多考区来考到这个留学到美国。这帮人后来惨了，冷战结束之后，吃应用物理的没饭吃了。那中国那个时候呢，也是有这样的问题，所以我几个哥们同学我要把他们劝离开9院就是下海了。那么9院这个地方的神秘性和重要性，就是这些人出来当一个部长也好，当一个政协副主席也好，都一点都不是抬高他们。他们站在中共的角度来讲，做出的贡献之大就像美国，对吧？这个早一段时间那个电影，对吧？你就可以看得出来，实际上这个当上的科学家比一个部长还牛，对吧？或者影响力还要大跟那个商业部长在国会作证听证这些政治斗争。所以邱勇我不了解他的背景，但是呢，我大概估计他就是学应用物理的。
那么这个9所的名字是怎么来的？叫第2机械工业部第9研究所从这个名字来的这个我们就看到这个什么排序号的这一些研究部，第1所、第2所、第3所，带有浓重的这个苏联时代的这样的一个社会主义体制的特点
那个时候的工厂也是这样，什么807工厂
对
，40都是骗自己人的。
听上去好像是某一种神秘的代号实际上这名字缺乏某一种美感那我们就看到一提到9院9所提到现在这个中务院，大家可能想到的就是2弹1星的确2弹1星之父还真的就是这个地方出来的。后来也如何明先生所说，在中国的这个工业化整个的这个过程中也是担任了一些重要部门的官员。所以从这个角度来看呢，邱勇出任科技部副部长并不让人觉得惊讶。但是让人觉得惊讶的是什么呢？那我们知道科技部在之前是国务院机制改革2会之后呢，是经历了一次改组，普遍认为呢，对于科技部的我们叫做这个重心是有所加大，这是一方面。第二一方面呢，就是现在这一次我们看到金融委之外有一个比金融委更神秘的科技委，这个科技委到现在也是不知道到底领导人是谁，所以就让人觉得你说你有这么一个搞核武器的人到科技部来当一个副部长，你还不知道这个金融委科技委到底是怎么一个布置，你是不是在谋划什么大局那我们说这个2弹1星2弹1星大家这个名字一听起来想到了上个世纪计划经济时代中国呢是如何突破封锁达成了某一种经济的或者是科技的这一方面的成就。其实与它对应的也是美国有一个叫曼哈顿计划，就是刚才何明先生提到的奥本海默这一部电影里面所讲到的美国的核武计划。那么以外界我们在这个观众朋友们中一直有这样一种声音，认为这个什么2弹1星举国体制搞科研完全就是骗自己人这种呢勒紧裤腰带搞科学只能是历史上这个我们叫做误打误撞成功那么一次，根本就不是搞科研的道路。但是何必先生
抱歉，我打扰你了，我怕等真将忘了这些话。这个里面的问题出在什么地方呢？就是80年代中国成一个完全封闭的一个落后的这个时代已经没什么关系的这么一个国家， 走向这个现代化的过程中是打开窗户一看，世界上已经完全是另外一个世界了。所以那个时候形成了一个80年代的一种学习的热潮。这种学习的热潮，除了学数理化、学习这个出来留学或者是怎么的理由那个时候没有理由或者是怎么样，那个时候就出现了一代知识分子。这一代知识分子在今天很多已经退休了，但是呢，他们仍然有很大的影响力，尤其是对中国体制的批评，有些东西是很有道理的。但是对于他们的描述的西方，是他们80年代的那种西方。如果你真正到了美国，到了欧洲，你对美国的体制、欧洲的体制、日本、澳大利亚，你都会有更深刻的认知
那比如说，
但是正是因为垂换这种认知，这些人呢产生了一种就是说非常简化西方的一种倾向，而这种简化西方的倾向对中国的牛无知的这些网民来讲就造成了非常大的这种蛊惑性的作用。从市场经济到治国体制，基本上都是垂范对市场经济和现代化体制的了解的人，但是这些人在中国大行其事是我刚刚学了一个词叫暴发户名人。叫名人暴发户，就是一个华盛顿邮报有一个人专门写文章，我刚刚看到，我觉得这个名字挺好。这些暴发户就是大胆的扭曲了。
这个和平建设类似的观点，我们在节目中已经强调了很多次我们之前也为大家解释过，说硅谷实际上就是居民融合的产物。斯坦福大学、MIT 实际上都是居民融合的产物，都是军工综合体的产物而其实这个曼哈顿计划更是典型的。都不是居民融合，它就是一个军方的项目。曼哈顿计划，那我们知道是美国陆军部在1942年启动的，一直就得到了美国政府的支持，最后是花掉了美国政府多少钱呢？20亿美元3年的时间才建成了。那我们说是不是曼哈顿计划？那我们说是战争时期某一种这个不得不为之的政府引领的科技计划呢？其实根本不是大家所想的这样。后来的阿波罗登月计划也是美国政府支持的科学探索计划，后来的人类基因组计划那更是美国联邦政府支持的计划。再比如比较近期的这个引力波探测计划，都是美国政府支持的庞大的科研项目，而且结果都非常的好。所以我们就说这个政府支援科研这个本身并不是一个弊病。其实相反，现在在科研界大家往往把科学研究是分成2个不同的类别，一种叫什么呢？叫做小科学。什么叫做小科学呢？就是我们一般讲到的自由经济、自由竞争下的这种科研模式是什么呢？就是说一个天才的科学家自己引领一个小小的实验团队在这个实验室里面孤军奋战最后形成了这样的一个科学研究成果。现在这一种叫做小科学，叫做 small science。还有一种呢，现在不管是在美国的高校里面，还是在科研界，都有很多的讨论，叫什么呢？叫大科学，叫 big science。大科学比小科学要大呀。什么叫做大科学呀？实际上就是由政府机构、科研项目，还有就是来自于全世界的科学家团队形成的这一种我们叫做以计划在先的强大资金力量支持，而不是以商业和实用目的为目的的这样的一种科学研究项目。因此简而言之，小科学和大科学的区别是什么呢？小科学我们可以想到是牛顿、达尔文、爱因斯坦这一类科学家，但是呢，大科学是什么呢？是曼哈顿计划，是阿波罗登月计划、人类基因组计划等等等等。因此我们说不能说这个是阿波罗登月更伟大，还是这个牛顿苹果掉头上比这个对于科学的进益更大。实际上它代表的是两种科学研究不同的方式所产生的不同的思路所以这一点我们先进行澄清并不是说这个政府引领的科学研究就一定失败。但是我们在提到9院，提到今天我们为大家介绍到的这一次人事变动的时候还涉及到一个更加重要的问题。那我们知道，虽然现在是有一个可能是搞核物理出身的这样的一个科学家，曾经在中国唯一的这样一个核研究单位担任领导职务的科学家来出任科技部的副部长，这可能并不是中国要打某一些核战争的准备的信号相反呢，可能是由于他之前在从事所谓大科学领导大科学研究的这一方面的经验，要为中国下一次的曼哈顿计划也好，阿波罗登月计划也好，人类基因组计划也好，形成某一种政府力量的支持。那我们就要问一个问题，就是中国下一个曼哈顿计划，或者是中国下一个2弹一星计划，到底是部署在哪一方面？是面对西方有可能卡脖子我们的芯片， 还是面对人工智能领域可能带来的更多的挑战？这一点何明先生怎么看啊？
我早几天专门跟我们的刘博士进行一个对话，其中就讲到了创新的问题。我觉得创新不是西方人批评说你们没有创新能力，不是，是中国人非常的自我卑微的认为我们中国人只会搞制造业，不会的这个创新。其实第一，忽视了这个创新的定义，不仅是创造发明。经营管理甚至营销，这都是创新的一个范围。从这个意义来讲，中国在很多方面所以我做了一个标题叫"中国现在最闪亮的就是创新"。其中我还不是讲它在营销，在企业化的过程中间创新，我就认为在科学技术方面，中国已经进入了一个爆发期，一个准备期当然跟美国一比，也许中国人可以，很多科学家都说我们什么都不是，对吧？像有一个教授就是说，中国的数学落后了多少年，中国一些物理学家就说中国的物理那全部是中学物理就是这种说法吧，从科学家的那种自卑也好，或者是这个女不惊人死不休也好，反正我们知道一些老头也是特别的傲慢，也是特别的胡说八道，对吧？也可以有这种声音让大家刺激一下，别狂妄。但事实上，诚实的讲，中国某些方面可能相差很远，但是某些方面中国已经非常领先了。那么中国一个要保持这个领先的趋势，现在无非不是几方面嘛。航天工业这是绝对的一个，你看得出来中国的那种速度之快到了一种无法想象的地步。当我们看这个电视里面看杨利伟吧，这个做了个对象，我们觉得多可惜。你这个东西几十年以前美国人就可以了，那是几年以前了。现在中国的这样一种航天的能量之大，对吧？未来的航天肯定是一个真实的一个，是不是会构成真正的星球大战，我们不知道。第二个就是能源嘛，对吧？能源是这个一切之母一切之母。中国怎么去在大科学方面去寻找能源的解决之道那当然还有基因这些主要的一些科学领域，我都认为是中国的未来的曼哈顿计划都会搞。但是哪个东西搞成我们也不知道，因为这个里面呢涉及到经费的问题，涉及到领导才干的问题，涉及到官僚体系的问题。因为你讲了一个大科学我觉得你今天这个定义非常好。大科学你个意义上更多的是倾向于管理，倾向于的集合，倾向于协足。曼哈顿的计划了不起的地方是一讲起来美国人都是自由主义，你别搞错了，10万人要被一些军方的官僚控制在里面，还有情报系统，又是科学家，又是每个人都有个性，对吧？混杂在一起，又是一个当年的社会主义时代、共产党的时代，所以非常的具有爆炸性、冲突性的很强的这么一个时代，曼哈顿。但是它这阵组合起来了，它不是一个爱因斯坦，也不是一个奥本海默个人。那么这个里面呢，就是让他成为一个副部长，可能就有利于这个领导，因为工程学院更多是一个专业的一个头衔，科学部就可以统筹这个这样一种资源。那么你刚才讲了，我们之前也讨论过科技委，科技委为什么不公布这个名字呢？其实不是习近平不能公布，也不是李强不能公布。关键是下面的干事的不能公布，
对，
这是干事的
被公布就上制裁名单了。
对，可能到了这个德国，或者是到了英国，或者是到了这个日本，都会被绑架了，或者是被暗杀了。那真有这种情况，伊朗那些科学家，那不就是这个大科学的一部分吗？
对，
那也是伊朗大科学的一部分了。这些人实际上比你单个的科学家的单个的时代，牛顿那个苹果的时代，甚至包括我们特斯拉那个天才的时代，其实都过去了。现在的这种科学的组成合作才是曼哈顿的一个核心价值。不是曼哈顿，我们一定要研究一个绝对毁灭人类的一个东西，而是要形成一种真正的科学资源的一种组合。
好，这个何斌先生讲的非常的有道理，但是我们也要特别给我们的观众朋友们提几个醒，就是这个大科学听起来非常的恢宏实际上也有几个潜在的危险。第一个，其实刚才何斌先生也暗示到了，就是外行领导内行，有的时候的确是会出现这样的一个情况国家有这样的一个首要事项，但是呢，如果是只让一个官僚来负责大科学，他可能真的是不懂。 他不懂的话呢，就拍脑袋决策，结果啊，可能就会做出很多啊与这个科学常识相反的这样的一个举动。实际上，之前中国搞的这个大基金中国搞的这个半导体，就是出现这样的一个问题，就是外行认为啊，只要是搞半导体啊，发钱，谁来半导体都可以，他自己可能连芯片是什么都不知道。所以从最近这一次的我们叫做国家主导的金融项目也好，国家主导的科技研究项目也好，都是出现了这样的一个趋势。就是说，之前我们为大家介绍的这个所谓的这个国企基金，习近平要搞风投是什么呢？就是说我是以专业化的形式来进行投资的筛选。虽然整个项目背后是国家力量，但是在项目的管理本身啊，有资方和管理方的这样的一个分离，管理还是要专业管理。那么像现在在很多这个科技项目、大科学的科技项目，似乎也有这样的一个趋势，就是当然背后是一个国家政府这样一个项目，但是到底往哪个方向走啊？不是政府某一个小官僚说了算了，也不是习近平本人拍板了，而是要真的找一些所谓的技术官僚，就是他曾经真的是有科学开发经验的这一些内行的管理人士来对项目的具体的方向进行管理。这可能是这一次比较重要的一点，也是所谓的大科学到底是搞成烂科学还是真的科学啊？可能是这样的一个重要的取决因素，这一点我们要向大家提醒。另外呀，我们很多何明先生经常讽刺的，受到80年代影响过深的这一批中国知识分子在提到国家主导的科学项目，还有私人企业或者是个体的经济学家通过灵感和自由市场产生的主意之间的差别的时候，经常会举到2个例子，一个是 NASA， 一个是美国著名民营企业家马斯克的这个 SpaceX
对。
那我们知道这个 NASA 和 SpaceX 相比真的就是大科学的失败的这样的一个典型那么之前呢，我们为大家特别推荐过的播客节目叫做《商业战争》，专门有一季讲的就是 NASA 和 SpaceX 之间的商业战争。简而言之这个 NASA 是什么呢？就是大科学失败的典型，就挥霍无度
对，
有的时候我们说这个一旦是政府出钱，那这个钱真的是后面加几个零都不算多我就记得在商业战争里面就特别讲到了一个让人觉得触目惊心的数字，就是在 NASA 研究这个火箭上有这样的一个我们叫做触动门这个触动门是什么呢？就是说这个门本身不能是因为空气对流的压力等等出现晃动一定是一个非常坚实的门。结果呢 ，NASA 进行了各种各样复杂的研究安全性测验高科技材料最后呢，给这个门这种特别的门的成本开价是多少呢？1500美元一个门。结果呢 ，SpaceX 工程师说这样的门不需要那么复杂的材料在这个高空对流情况下，这个门不会随便晃，那不就是飞机上的厕所吗？所以就用了飞机上厕所的这样的一个空间站的舱门的这个设计最后成本是多少呢？30美元一个。所以我们就说这个 SpaceX 的门是飞机上的厕所门，NASA 那个门是特别经过设计的1500美元的神秘的舱门，实际上完成的事情是一样的，但这个成本可是差了50倍，这个是一点。另外我们就说这个马斯克作为这个民营企业家那得是算计，因为钱是自己的钱，是割自己的肉所以这个马斯克实际上在火箭上真正意义上我们叫做跨时代、超越 NASA 的一个创新是什么呢？就是可以重复使用的火箭。因为我们知道这个火箭如果你试飞一次之后，火箭就得重新再造一个，那这个成本就大了去了。就相当于你每次开一辆车之后，你不仅仅是要给车加油，你还要重新换一辆车。NASA 当时采用的就是这一种开一次车换一次车这种做法，结果成本就非常的高。而在 SpaceX 这一边呢，他们所完成的就是说，执行飞行任务之后，这个飞机本身是可以进行重复使用的。也就是说，你的成本就是燃料和燃油的成本，这样就一下子把成本降下来了。所以在这个 NASA 这个几个亿没有完成的事情上，就让马斯克这样的一个初出茅庐，而且呢让人觉得不是特别有管理经验和管理才华的民营企业家完成了。这呢也是大科技和小科技之间的这样的一个比较，就是大科技的成本那是别人的钱。花起来可以比较挥霍，小科技的这些创新往往是企业家以及科学家，那么是在比较我们叫做有限的预算下所完成的，所以它不浪费。这一点我觉得也是我们需要特别提醒的。
不过这一点也要注意一点，就是大家都只知道，政府的大科学一烂尾大家都知道，
对，
但是小科学的烂尾大家都不知道。
对，小科学烂尾就不要出去声张就可以了。这一点呢，在科学界还特别有研究，就是有的时候 可能科学家写出的论文呐，这个论文的结果啊，不是大家想看到的，怎么办呢？那我就不发表了嘛。所以人家说发表一篇文章背后还有99篇没有发表的文章。其实啊，这可能代表的是大多数科学研究的结果啊。大家看到的往往是成功的典型。那么今天啊，我们为大家讲大科学和小科学，既不是说举国体制就比这个私人探索要好，也不是说这个举国体制啊就一无是处，而是借这一次人事调整，为大家介绍有关于科学研究的更多的情况。我们的观众朋友们中啊，有很多是引领过科研项目的，要么是现在在这个大学研究机构，要么呢是在这个负责高科技研究的商业企业做这个研发部门的这些负责人。那您对于大科技和小科技之间的区别有怎样的切身体会呢？这一次啊，这个科技部进行重组，这一次呢，科技委接到了重要的任务，外界看起来神秘非常。你认为现在他们的首要研究项目到底是什么？中国下一个两弹一星到底是要把什么发上天呢？如果您对于这些问题有理解的话呢，也欢迎您来到思想先驱报的俱乐部啊，这呢是我们专门为思想先驱报会员开辟的一个空间。加入方式也很简单，如果您加入华尔街电视的会员，或者到六度世界上啊，加入我们的专属会员讨论区，就可以一起参与我们对于这些问题的探讨了。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的主要内容，下期我们再会。
谢谢。
欢迎大家来到六度解析。天我们要讨论的是中国顶尖科学机构中国科学院 COP 的重大重组。这次重组旨在加强前沿和基础研究能力。这一举措反映了中国在创新和科技突破方面的努力，以应对美国的高科技限制，并通过技术和高附加值制造业推动经济增长。首先，中国科学院的组织架构调整设立了新的前沿科学与基础研究局、可持续发展研究局以及基础科学与技术能力局。这些新部门取代了之前负责教育、科学推广和传播的部门，显示出中国对基础和前沿研究的重视程度不断提升。然而，这种重组能否真正提高科研效率和创新能力，仍然值得观察。调整组织架构是一方面，如何真正落实并转化为实际的科研成果是更大的挑战。其次，前沿科学与基础研究局将重点研究数学、天文学、生命科学及基础学科交叉前沿等领域。这些研究领域的选择固然重要，但在具体实施过程中，如何确保这些研究得到足够的资金和资源支持，如何吸引和留住顶尖的科研人才，都是需要解决的问题。没有足够的人才和资源支持，再好的计划也难以实现。第三，政府重组科学技术部，意图引导更多资源用于鼓励创新和监督基础研究与应用科学。这一措施表明了政府对科技创新的重视。然而，政府干预过多可能会导致科研自由受到限制，从而影响创新的多样性和独立性。如何在支持和干预之间找到平衡，是政府需要谨慎考虑的。第四，尽管中国在原始创新方面投入巨大，但这一领域一直是北京实现科技超级大国目标的薄弱环节。许多创新成果仍然依赖于国外的基础研究和技术支持。为了真正实现自主创新，中国需要在国际合作和自主研发之间找到平衡，既要吸收国外先进技术，又要不断提高自主研发能力。第五，这次重组不仅是对内部结构的调整，更是对外部环境的一种积极回应。在当前国际环境下，中国正面临来自美国的高科技封锁和压力。通过加强基础和前沿研究，中国希望能够突破这些限制，实现自主创新。然而，在应对外部压力的同时，中国也需要警惕内部可能出现的过度防御心理，避免因过于强调自主创新而封闭自我，阻碍国际科技交流与合作。 最后，从长远来看，这种重组和调整对于中国实现科技自立自强具有重要意义。通过集中资源和力量，推动基础研究和前沿科技的发展，中国有望在关键领域取得突破，推动经济高质量发展。然而，这一过程中需要避免盲目追求短期成果，确保科研工作能够真正服务于社会和经济的长远发展。总结今天的讨论，中国科学院的重组不仅是一次机构调整，更是中国在应对国际科技竞争和实现自主创新方面的重要举措。这一变化将为中国在基础和前沿研究领域注入新的活力，推动科技进步和经济发展。但同时，我们也要看到其中的挑战和潜在问题，只有通过持续的努力和科学的管理，才能实现预期的目标。感谢大家收听今天的节目，希望我们的解析对您有所帮助。如果您有任何问题或建议，欢迎在节目后留言。我们下期再见。中国科学院简称中科院官网发布的一则人事任免通知，披露了该院内设机构调整的动向。这则由中科院党组发布的关于魏志祥等同志职务任免的通知成文于5月13日，内容为：经研究决定，魏志祥、沈毅同志任前沿科学与基础研究局副局长，文亚同志任可持续发展研究局局长，魏勇、许航同志任可持续发展研究局副局长，卢方军、杨维进同志任科技基础能力局副局长，谢高岗同志任财务与资产管理局局长，罗文同志任财务与资产管理局副局长，试用期至2024年7月。厉斌同志任财务与资产管理局副局长，试用期至2024年12月。尹烨同志任财务与资产管理局副局长，试用期至2025年4月。上述同志在院机关原部门的职务自然免除。澎湃新闻 3w.the paper.cn 注意到，该通知中提及的前沿科学与基础研究局、可持续发展研究局、科技基础能力局、财务与资产管理局均为官方首次公开披露。对比中科院官网公布的院机关配置，此前的前沿科学与教育局、科技促进发展局、科学传播局以及条件保障与财务局已不再出现在院机关之列。其中，魏志祥、沈毅此前担任前沿科学与教育局副局长，文亚此前担任科技促进发展局局长，魏勇、许航此前任副局长，卢方军、杨维进此前担任科学传播局副局长，谢高岗此前担任条件保障与财务局局长，罗文、厉斌、尹烨此前担任副局长。根据中科院各机关官网的介绍，新设的前沿科学与基础研究局负责数学、物理学、化学、天文学、力学、生命科学、基础前沿交叉等领域的学科建设、发展规划、科研平台建设与管理，相关领域重大科技任务的培育、争取、组织、协调与管理等。该局内设综合业务处、数学与交叉科学处、香山科学会议办公室、物理与化学处、天文力学处、生命科学处。可持续发展研究局负责农业科技、生物技术、地球与资源、大气海洋科学与生态环境等领域的学科建设、发展规划、科研平台建设与管理，相关领域重大科技任务的培育、争取、组织、协调与管理，负责植物园、标本馆的管理工作等。该局内设综合业务处、农业科技办公室、生物技术处、地球与资源处、大气海洋与生态环境处。科技基础能力局负责科技基础能力建设的统筹规划与组织协调，负责重大科技基础设施建设与管理，负责野外台站管理，负责科技条件建设，负责网络与信息化建设管理，负责科学数据系统的建设运维、开放利用等工作，负责文献情报管理，负责学术期刊与出版管理等。该局内设综合业务处、重大设施处、科技条件处、网络与信息化处、科学数据处、文献情报与期刊处。财务与资产管理局负责经济资源配置规划、政策和制度的制定实施，负责财务与资产管理，负责预算绩效管理与财务监管， 负责科研园区规划、基建投资规划和年度计划、基本建设管理，负责后勤支撑体系建设与保障，负责院机关财务管理等。该局内设综合处、预算处、资产财务处、资金绩效与监管处、投资与基建项目处、后勤保障处、机关财务处。欢迎来到六度解析。南华早报消息，6月9日，广东省政府发布了45项措施，旨在推动人工智能在各个行业的广泛应用，力争引领高科技增长。这些措施的目标包括到2024年将该省的人工智能产业价值提升至3000亿元人民币，约414亿美元，到2027年提升至4400亿元人民币。这些目标相当于广东省2023年 GDP 的 2.3% 和 3.3%。这些举措涵盖了从提升计算能力到芯片供应、人才培养等多个方面，显示了广东省在推动 AI 产业发展的雄心。在分析这些措施之前，我们必须了解广东省在中国政治和经济格局中的独特地位。10月15日是中共总书记习近平的父亲习仲勋诞辰110周年，陕西和广东省官媒当天发文纪念，缅怀他为中国发展做出的贡献。习仲勋是广东改革开放的重要推动者，他在主政广东期间，以大胆的改革举措和开创性的工作为广东的经济特区建设奠定了基础。中共陕西省委机关报《陕西日报》和中共广东省委机关报《南方日报》都在纪念文章中提到了习仲勋的历史贡献。南方日报特别指出，习仲勋在主政广东期间，以革命加拼命的精神，大胆工作，推动了广东在改革开放中先走一步。这些历史背景解释了为什么广东在现代化和高科技产业发展中具备领先优势。广东作为中国的经济强省，其在人工智能领域的布局有着深远的政治和经济意义。当前国际形势复杂，美国对中国实施了严格的技术限制，尤其是在高端半导体芯片和技术出口方面。为了应对这些挑战，中国必须在 AI 和高科技领域实现自主创新和突破。而广东作为习仲勋的改革试验田，再次承担起了这一重任。广东省政府发布的45项措施涵盖了从芯片供应到人才培养，从计算基础设施到算法设计等多个方面。这些措施不仅是为了促进 AI 产业的发展，更是为了确保在国际科技竞争中占据有利位置。例如，广东计划到2024年将计算能力提升至40 exaflops， 到2027年提升至60 exaflops。这些目标显示了广东在计算能力方面的雄心壮志。除了技术和产业政策，广东还非常重视人才培养。措施中提到，将通过政策吸引顶尖的 AI 人才，并实施关键技术技能的培训计划。复旦大学即将在下学年开设100多门新的 AI 课程，这显示了中国在培养下一代 AI 人才方面的巨大投入。这些人才将成为推动广东乃至中国 AI 产业发展的中坚力量。然而，尽管这些措施看起来非常全面和雄心勃勃，我们也必须看到其中的挑战和潜在问题。首先，广东是否真的能实现这些宏伟的目标，还有待观察。AI 产业的快速发展需要强大的技术支持、持续的资金投入以及全球性的合作与交流。在当前国际环境下，尤其是在美国的技术封锁和限制下，如何实现自主创新是一个巨大的挑战。其次，广东的措施虽然在短期内可能会带来显著的经济效益，但长期来看，如果缺乏持续的技术突破和创新动力，可能会面临产业同质化和技术瓶颈的问题。此外， AI 技术的广泛应用还涉及伦理和社会问题，如数据隐私、算法偏见等，这些问题需要在政策制定过程中予以充分考虑。总的来说，广东省发布的45项 AI 发展措施显示了其在高科技产业方面的雄心和决心。这些措施不仅是对当前国际技术限制的应对，也是对广东省历史使命的延续。然而，在实现这些目标的过程中， 广东还需要克服诸多技术、经济和社会挑战。我们将继续关注这些措施的实施进展，并在未来的节目中为您带来更多的分析和解读。另外，中国欧盟商会年度调查显示，欧洲公司在中国南方的信心低于中国其他地区。分析人士认为，这种差距是生产能力转移和香港转口贸易功能下降的直接结果。中国欧盟商会与罗兰贝格咨询公司今年早些时候进行的年度调查发现，南方的会员企业在收入和盈利方面的下降更为明显。根据上周发布的调查结果，近 40% 的南方受访者报告称，2023年的收入较2022年明显下降， 17% 的人收入下降超过 20%。而在中国其他地区，收入下降如此严重的受访者比例仅为 0% 到 10%。大约 32% 的南方受访者表示，2023年的息税前利润较2022年下降，只有 26% 的人对未来2年的业务前景持乐观态度，这两个数据都低于中国其他地区的企业。近年来，许多在华南的欧盟企业将生产能力转移到西北和华北，甚至更多转移到东南亚。深圳当代观察研究所创始人刘开明说道，该智库监测着数百家中国代工厂的供应链情况。此外，香港转口贸易功能的显著缩减也影响了在华南的外国企业的业务。会员们原本预计2023年会是一个好年头，因为这是疫情开放后的第一年。中国欧盟商会副会长兼华南分会主席克劳斯·曾克尔说道，超过一半的华南受访企业报告称在吸引和留住国际人才方面遇到了困难，而在全国范围内，这一比例为 38%。36% 的受访者表示他们没有从大湾区计划的发展中受益，这一比例在2022年为 34%。该调查对中国的529家公司进行了调查，主要集中在工业产品和服务、消费品和服务以及专业服务领域。对于华南地区，约有70家公司参与了调查。由于部分公司没有回答所有问题，因此未给出精确的数字。会员们原本预计2023年会是一个好年头，因为这是疫情开放后的第一年。但由于2022年客户因不确定性和不可预测性囤积了大量库存，导致2023年的新订单减少，克劳斯·曾克尔说道。他的分会还指出，当地政府今年实施了包括免签旅行在内的政策，以解决欧洲企业，特别是中小企业报告的商业障碍。他们希望能够推出更多的举措。企业在转移红利、投资、市场扩展和人才留用方面也遇到了挑战，这在一定程度上可以归因于现有的监管负担。分会表示，南方的受访者报告称，他们对外资企业的待遇持负面看法。大约 41% 的南方受访者表示，在过去几年中遇到了将红利转出中国的困难。全国范围内，调查显示，中国经济放缓是企业面临的最大挑战。55% 的受访者将其列为关注点，而2023年这一比例为 36%。全球经济放缓、美中紧张局势、地缘政治风险和来自民营企业的竞争紧随其后。
How did you grow up? You grew up in Hong Kong, and how did you get interested in whatever ended up, in your field right now?
All right. I grew up in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony at the time, and most people in Hong Kong were relatively poor. At the time, it was like a developing, it's not a country, it's a colony. It's a developing society, and most people were not very well educated at the time. In my parents' generation, they all got clobbered by the war and the World War II, and the education were interrupted, and many of them don't formally go to school, and both of my parents did not finish high school, and but they were just like many Asian parents. They are very adamant that all the children should be well educated, and that's what they put the emphasis on. So I we're very grassroots type family. We live in very cramped apartments, and when I was at a very young age, we kind of won the lottery from the government, because at the time the government was building plenty of government housing,
high-rise
apartments that have that they rent out to the population at very low prices, low rent, and so we sort of won the lottery and moved into one of those, and that really changed our trajectory. And we stayed there. I grew up there in the housing project, and later on, as our family got a little bit more resources, we moved out to private housing. But the early years, we grew up in a housing project, which really immersed us into the general public of the society, which gave me a pretty good perspective of what the society is about.
Who would have put more premium on education amongst your parents? Was it your dad or your mom?
Both of them, because they didn't have the chance to go through formal education, and so they realized, and right after the war, everybody needs to make a living, so to speak, and so there wasn't much of an opportunity for them to get a formal education. So they are very insisting that everybody should in the family should be well educated.
How did you discover electrical engineering? I mean, you could have done other things, right?
Yeah, I could have done other things. That was, I guess, the society at the time gravitated towards STEM type education, because that seems to be a kind of like a ticket to a better life, better career. And the humanities and the arts are less well defined. For example, if you're licensed to become an engineer, then of course you're licensed to practice, you got a good career and so on. Whereas the other professions seems to be more nebulous and less well defined. And so a lot of the kids at the time who did well in school tend to pick one of the STEM fields to go into, and so no exception for me. Follow the crowd and enter kind of go into a science type curriculum. And out of the science type of curriculum, the physics and the chemistry part of the science curriculum is more kind of quantitative and formal, and makes it easier to quantify, and at least for me, it's easier to understand. And rather than, for example, in biology, for example, it's more to me at the time, it looks like a more observational science. You need to remember a lot of things.
Right.
And I'm not very good at remembering things. So
you're being modest.
So the physics and the chemistry looks better. Now, when I was about to enter college or university at the time, the careers for people who study basic science is rather limited, because there's not a basic science research as in the US it is today, right? But being a basic science researcher is not a career in Hong Kong at the time, right? So most of the science type careers are more practical. Engineering is one of them. So many of our contemporaries becomes engineers. And out of all the engineering, electrical engineering is closest to physics. And it uses many of the same concepts in physics, quantum mechanics and electromagnetics and so on. They're more closer to physics. So that's why I got attracted to it.
Yeah. I think it's probably safe to assume that countries or nations or governments or political cultures within each that would have put strong emphasis on STEM, they tend to have done well, as opposed to those that probably put less emphasis on STEM, right? Would you attribute this to the political culture in your household, or sort of like the pervasive political culture at any dimension, at any level? Or you think this would have been something that would have been driven by the leadership of that country, that nation, or the government?
I think if you talk about, I think if you look at many of the Asian countries, they have this strong emphasis on STEM.
Yeah.
And my crude understanding is that from an economic development point of view, you do need these skills from an economic development point of view. If you want to build infrastructure, you need engineers to build the bridges and roads and so on and so forth. If you want to have industry, you need people who can do the engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and so on and so forth. That's, I think, mostly coming from the point of view of economic development. But I should say that economic development in and of itself only takes you so far. At some point, the society will need things other than economic development. Yeah. And that's where the humanities and the arts and so on comes in, that people in society are not just simply satisfied with the money.
Right.
But beyond, there's a lot more than making a living. Once you are comfortable about making a living, then you look for something else. I think that is the part that a lot of the Asian countries may not have recognized.
I'm just, sensing that there's still quite a lot of countries that have not focused on STEM as much as some countries that we might have seen.
Why so?
Not sure. I mean, I'm in the camp that believes that I think a higher degree of focus on STEM is correlated with your ability to move marginal productivity, because that's correlated with innovation and all that good stuff, right? And being able to combine that with liberal arts or humanities, I think that makes it even more a good combination. But some countries, I think, tend to focus a lot less on STEM. And that I think has hampered development to some extent. And I'm just happy with how Hong Kong, has put a lot of emphasis on STEM, along with some other Asian countries, such as Korea, China, Japan, and now recently, you've talked about Vietnam and Southeast Asia, right? You can see that in the tenacity with which the people of Vietnam, I think, are focusing on STEM. I come from a region, called Southeast Asia, where I think the focus on STEM needs to be, more emphasized going forward. You went to Hong Kong University.
Yeah.
Then you decided to move to the US.
Yes.
Why?
Well, very simple. I am interested in kind of more advanced knowledge beyond the bachelor's degrees type education. I was looking for a place where I could get a PhD. At the time, it was in early 80s. None of the universities in Hong Kong are what you would call a research university. They're basically teaching universities. Just in the colonial days, the universities in Hong Kong are meant to train bureaucrats for the civil servants in service of the government, and they're not interested in doing research. So there's really no opportunity to do any research in Hong Kong. Yeah. So I came to the US.
And it's worked out okay with you?
So far, I'm okay, I guess.
Now I want to shift gear to your area of focus. I mean, I know you're teaching electrical engineering, and you're one of the few people that understand the semiconductor, sector. Why is it called semi, not full conductor?
That's interesting. But before I get to that, let me just finish by your previous question. I think my kind of journey from Hong Kong to the US is a very typical journey for many immigrants who are in the technology field.
Right.
They got educated in their home country and came to the US, saw an opportunity to get better education, and then many of them do stay. And I think it's a very important source of talent for the U.S. And maybe we could come back to that later. But I think it's really important. If you look around in academia, in industry, many of them do come through this route of getting an advanced degree and ended up staying.
It's been the main source of innovation in the U.S.
Absolutely. If you look at top management CEOs of big companies, many of them come through this route. And that's very important.
Well, while on this, I mean, do you see that as something that's likely to continue, given?
I think that's in jeopardy.
Okay.
Given the recent,
the political calculus seems to be.
Seems to be the pendulum has swung to the other side in recent years, and you see a lot of soul searching about immigrants or foreign students and openness in research and things like that. And that, I think, that creates an environment in which, when for a potential student from other countries looking at the U.S., and they would begin to think about whether this is the right place for them, or rather they would go to some other countries to get their education and the experience. When I was just graduating from college, that answer is very obvious. Where do you go? The U.S., of course. But now
you've got optionalities.
Now we got options, and also not only options from a pull point of view, but from a push point of view.
Correct.
A lot of people felt that the U.S. may not be so welcoming as before, and so that, I think, that route or that flow of people is somewhat in jeopardy.
On the other question, why is it called semi?
Oh, why is it called semiconductor? I forgot who I heard it from when somebody talked about semiconductors, and somebody who's not in the field asked, why semiconductor? How come a full conductor is not better? Cup half full? Well, what is a semiconductor? A semiconductor is a material that, as its name implies, not very conducting, not very insulating, and somewhere in between. And why do I want something in between? It's because a full conductor would be something like a piece of metal, like copper or silver or that kind of thing, right? So a full conductor. Now, not a full, but a real conductor, basically. Why semiconductor? Semiconductor is used to build switches, like electrical switches, wall switches, flip on the switch and turn on the lights. And computers are actually a bunch of switches. We compute by designing the organization, arranging switches, how to route the switches around. In the early days, the telephone, you have a switchboard, and you have real people who connect one line with another, that in a switchboard. And all these are replaced by chips today, of course. And so computers do computation by flipping switches, basically. So a semiconductor can be turned on to be conducting, or be turned off to be not conducting. And that basically is what a switch is about. So a semiconductor is used to build switches. And so that's why semiconductors are useful, because it can be turned on or turned off.
Gordon Moore, he came up with this prognosis decades ago that, things were going to behave in a certain way by way of the capacity growth, the speed growth, It's been very, very accurate.
Yes.
Right? Every year and a half to two, the doubling of the capacity and the speed. What's going to happen with Moore's Law?
Okay, first of all, that Moore's Law, which you refer to, doubling of something, initially he was just suggesting doubling the number of transistors on a chip. And later on, people modified it and double anything, which is not really what he meant, but people tend to associate it with Moore's Law that way.
Right.
But that one is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's actually a rather unusual situation for a technology or for industry. I believe one of my colleagues, Professor Jim Plummer, once said that he's not aware of any other industry that has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, namely that everybody thinks that in X number of years, such things will happen.
Right.
And so because companies are competing, because there's a prediction out there, companies are trying to either meet or exceed that prediction so that you can be better than your competitor. So as a result of that competition to get to that particular goal, that goal is satisfied because of the intense competition. And also, that also not only just the desire to compete, but also having a goal allows everybody up and down the chain, the entire chain of events, from materials to device technology to circuit design and architecture and so on and so forth, up and down the chain to have a predictable cadence. You say, let's say I'm designing something. I need what I designed to be run on some kind of chip. Now, I cannot start designing the chip unless I know what the chip technology can do, what the capability is. Just like if you try to run a marathon, right. I cannot win the marathon unless I know what my capability is. So you need to know what the capability is before you can design your chip. Now, without that prediction, you wouldn't be able to say, I'm going to design this based on this assumption that the chip technology will give me this kind of performance. I cannot do that. But with this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, I know in 2 years, the chip technology will advance to a point where I can count on that particular performance. And so therefore, I will tailor my design based on that assumption. And that's very powerful.
Very powerful. It sort of framed the behavior of the industries.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Consistently for decades. Even that I gave the example of designing chips, even down to the material supplier. The material supplier knows that the chip manufacturer will need this kind of material or will need this kind of material to have that kind of performance in 2 years. So therefore, I work on developing it with the full knowledge that when I get done, I will have a customer. That risk mitigation is very important. If I develop something, I spent millions, multi-million dollars developing something. I didn't know whether there's a customer. But that's bad.
Yeah.
But in this case, I know.
You know, at the risk of quoting you in previous conversations, at the rate that the percentage of how the chips occupy our lives, if not lifestyles, at an increasing rate. Whether it's opening your window in the car, turning on your toaster, turning on your microwave oven, whatever, before you get to the more complex stuff. What's going to happen to Moore's law? Is it likely to be more exponential than whatever we have seen in the last few decades?
I think there are two dimensions of it. Well, for short answer, yes, it's going to be more exponential.
Yeah.
Okay. Why do I say that? First, for the last several decades, we know that there's one way to improve the performance of the chips, which is to make it smaller. And there are a lot of physics involved and to explain why making it smaller is better. Right? So we know that there's one way, and we've been kind of turning that knob for several decades now.
Right.
And that knob has kind of saturated a little bit, just like anything else. You put the gas pedal, it hits the floor. Right? In the beginning, you're accelerating, but then pretty soon you hit the floor. Right? So that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that progress will not continue to be made, because there are many other knobs there are many other ways to make progress. It's just the analogy I'd like to have is for the past 50 years, we've been walking inside a tunnel. There's only one way ahead. We know what the goal is, and we just want to make progress. And to make progress, that's one, making devices, making transistors and memory smaller will allow us to pack more devices on the same chip and therefore get more functionality, better performance, and so on. That method is the one method that we know, and that is saturating, but it's more or less like walking inside a tunnel. There's no way to go, it's the only way forward. But now we're at the exit of the tunnel. Now at the exit of the tunnel, there are two ways to interpret it. One, you fall off the cliff, you're just dead. Second is the world is open, wide open, no more confining. You cannot go left or right. You can go anywhere you want. And I think my interpretation is we're at the exit of a tunnel. There's so many possibilities, and we will continue to grow in capability in an exponential way or even faster. Now, why am I so optimistic about that? Is because necessity is the mother of inventions. And that my optimism arises from the fact that society demand more from these chips, not less. The society will demand more and more from semiconductor technologies, chip technology in the coming decades than we have done in the past few decades. So because it's coming from the demands, innovation will come up and bring the technology up in a much faster pace than before, because we are not confined by the tunnel anymore.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Geopolitics could go wrong. Okay. I think that's a very important aspect that wasn't there just maybe like a handful of years ago. I think that is an important part because research and development thrive on collaboration. And there are many, many examples. We can go into that a little bit more later. But it thrives on collaboration. And if geopolitics cause collaboration to not happen, then the rate of progress will be severely curtailed. I think that is something that could go wrong.
You know, we're going through this era of what I call multipolarity, right? And I've said it before that ironically in a multipolar world, multilateralization becomes more difficult because there's this tendency of revisionism by the new middle powers or greater than middle powers, right? And the pre-existing superpowers are not comfortable in embracing this new mode of multipolarity. I want to put this in the context of what you've been affiliated with, TSMC, right? They've basically created a recipe for success that involved a lot of collaborative undertakings, right? From a supply chain standpoint, from a research and development standpoint, from what have you, not just amongst enterprises, but also between academia and policymaking and entrepreneurship, right? What made them the way they were or they are?
I think your observation is extremely astute in the sense that a lot of people think a company like TSMC is a collection of factories and tools,
right? Or
even just factory workers.
Yeah.
And that's about it. But really, it is not. It is an enterprise that involves a lot of collaborations, that thrive on the network of customers, network of suppliers, network of collaborators in research and development, network of collaboration with the broader society than which they lives in,
right?
The Taiwan society. It is a network of all these things and even more, perhaps, I didn't go into. So that piece, that collection of relationship is what makes this company the way it is. Let's say we all of a sudden transplant this company to another country or another place that doesn't have the same political, economic system. It is highly questionable whether they can continue to operate the way it is.
Yeah. So how do other countries try to replicate just any bit of what TSMC might have been able to do? And I'm not singling TSMC out here. There have been others that have been legendary and great, right?
Yeah.
The Samsungs of the world, the Intels of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think TSMC has proven itself to be very resilient and very different. And their success seems to be sustainable so far.
So far, yes.
Right? And go back to the history of how it came about. Go back to that conversation between Morris Chang, the legendary Morris Chang, with, somebody or some people in Taiwan that made it the way it has become.
I think there are two, if not more, at least two very important elements. One, technology competition is really a talent competition. First, talent. Yeah. Second, the broader society's support of the industry, not just the company, but the industry itself. You need a infrastructure for the company to exist, and suppliers, customers, and so on. So let's talk about talent first.
Right.
Taiwan in the early days of the 60s, 70s through the 80s and 90s have sent, well, it's not that the government sent them, but students from that era, all after they graduate from college, they all went out to the US, to Europe, outside of Taiwan, who has more advanced education achievements in the universities to get education. And many of them stayed in the local host countries to gain work experience. And in time, many of them go back to Taiwan to continue the career for a variety of reasons. Sure. Want to be closer to home. And I guess that's maybe perhaps one of the biggest draw, be closer to home, or perhaps a perceived better career opportunity in the home country. So like playing in the home field, right? So which people sometimes feel more advantageous, and knowing the culture and the people well. So talent, the flow of talent is one of the most important things. If you look at the leaders of the tech industry in Taiwan today, many of them were educated in the US through this route, getting educated in college, go to other countries, the US, Europe, and so on, and go back to Taiwan, have a work experience, go back to Taiwan, bring the work experience, bring the knowledge with them. And that is very important. That is, I would say, perhaps is one of the major ingredients for the success. And it's not just limited to Taiwan, Korea as well. Yeah. We look at the many top management in Samsung and Hynix and so on. Many of them were educated in the US. So that's one part of it. But that's one piece. But the other piece, which is important, is support of the society. If you think about how the semiconductor industry was started in Taiwan, it was really supported by the government. It's industrial policy, basically. The Taiwan government decided that this is an industry they want to get into, and they supported with building industrial parks, with starting ITRI, the industrial Technology Research Institute, which spun off TSMC and many other companies as well. So the government really have a really robust industrial policy. Now, of course, industrial policy may or may not succeed. If you bet on the wrong thing, that's bad, right? And that's really, of course, if you're in the U.S., you know that the U.S. feels that they don't need an industrial policy, right? And we don't go into that. But in this particular case, industrial policy worked out for them. And the government really supported it, building industrial parks, finding other pieces of the puzzle to fill in the infrastructure for this semiconductor industry, and also basically the technology industry. Back in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, Taiwan basically manufactured, but basically it's the world's manufacturer for PCs and
everything, even bicycles.
In bicycles, yeah, bicycles as well, yeah. And so the government really supported it with really strong industrial policy.
That's amazing. Now, in early days, a lot of the intellectual property with respect to the microchip technology was done in the U.S. Do you think that with the benefit of hindsight of the U.S. were to decide otherwise, meaning they would have wanted to onshore the manufacturing capabilities as opposed to offshore the manufacturing capabilities, would things have been different?
This is a very complex problem that I've been thinking about more recently, and I haven't come to any reasonable resolution or answer yet. And I can tell you what the kind of disconnect or problems are. One is, in the U.S., this, as I said, this is a technology competition, it's a talent competition. If you look at the cost of talents in Asian countries and in the U.S., the cost differential is pretty high. Right. So it's
getting smaller, but back then it was huge.
Oh, it was huge. It was huge, right? So to get talented people working on hard engineering problems in, let's say, in Taiwan or in Singapore or in Korea, is way less costly than it is in the U.S. So in other words, they could deploy many high-skilled talents to solve engineering problems, whereas the U.S. is at a disadvantage in terms of cost. Not capital cost, but just talent cost, right? Give an example. I recently went through more than 20 years of TSMC annual report. Every year, they report on the education level of the employees. Starting from 1999, about 40% of the employees have a bachelor's degree and above. Today, 80%.
Wow.
Now, that coincides precisely with the steady climb in the technology ladder, the leadership race, the steady climb from beginning. They were licensing it from RCA, licensing technology from the US and bring it back to Taiwan. Gradually, they learn how to do things themselves. And the way to do that is to get talented people. So they started from 40% people, employees who has a bachelor's degree and above, to today, 80%. And so that really tells you technology competition is a talent competition.
Okay, in this context, which other countries do you think have done as much or just about the same amount that Taiwan has done? And I mean, when you think about talent, you think about human capital, you think about countries that have shown, right, abilities to project intellectual capital, right? Within Asia or within the world, which countries do you think are likely to be able to emulate the kinds of successes that we've seen in Taiwan?
Well, I've seen like countries like Singapore, Korea have been tremendously successful.
Yeah.
Like Korea, I remember back in the 60s and 70s, Korea was nowhere to be found,
nowhere,
right?
Yeah.
And then later on, they have kind of Me Too type products.
Right.
And we associate those
kind
of products.
You usually start out with Me Too's.
Yeah,
then you start being innovative and unique.
Exactly. Right. And then slowly they climb up the learning curve. And I remember years ago when you see Samsung, I said, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
You know,
well, now it's
not reliable. Now it's the best thing in the world. Right? So these countries have done quite well.
What about China?
China is, I don't think we could ignore their capability. They have, let me talk about something that I'm familiar with, just research.
Right.
I'm academia, I know research. Years ago, we have technical conferences and we see papers from China and say, forget it. Just quality is so bad. It's not even competitive.
No, it's very different.
Now, that was probably in the 80s and the 90s. Now, they're better than us. They're better than us. If you look at, papers, publications, data from key conferences in the chips business. For example, in the International Electronic Devices Meeting, which is a device technology conference, the biggest one in our field. International Solid-State Circuits Conference, the Circuits and System Conference in our field, the two biggest conferences in our field. You basically flipped. Years ago, the U.S. had the majority of the papers. I remember there were roughly about 40 to 50% of the papers were from the U.S. And China, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they were nowhere to be found. Today, China and Asia, the papers are more than 40%, almost close to 50%.
Oh my gosh.
And the US has steadily declined from 40, 50% to 30 to 40%. And the rest of the world, principally Europe and Japan, has basically fallen off the cliff. So the research and development, the research capability in Asian countries, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on, have really become the strongest region in terms of producing good quality research. I'm not just talking about quantity, it's quality. And the only thing that I see that the US is still a little bit ahead is in coming up with the new ideas. What the Chinese always say, going from 0 to 1. Namely, starting from nowhere, nothing, and come up with this really new idea. And if I look at what I would call new idea that is not been discussed before, the U.S. still, if you read the research papers, the U.S. still is the principal place where these new ideas come from. But once these new ideas become known, then
you see mushrooming of this new ideas in other places.
Exactly. And I feel it in my everyday research with my students.
Oh my gosh.
Any new ideas that we come up with, once they become known, this is a good idea.
The next week it will show up in China.
It will show up in China, not only that they do it better than you.
Yeah.
I cannot compete anymore. They have better resources, they have more students, they have more funding from the government. I cannot compete anymore. I have to get out of that field.
I want to get back to this, but I want to ask you about two countries like India and Israel. I mean, they have tremendous human capital, right? Do you see them as contenders in being able to, replicate the kinds of successes?
India has tremendous potential. It's tremendous potential. Their human capital is unbelievable. Not only They are a very populous country, of course.
Right. They got scale.
Yeah, they got scale, right? And the statistics work out for them, right? When you have scale,
sure,
then there are going to be outliers who are really smart and very innovative and so on, just like China, right? So that they have, that's very important. I think they have tremendous potential if they do things right, because they got scale, the people are smart, right? And in terms of Israel, they don't have scale. They're a small country, right? But they are smart people, obviously. The difficulty they have is lack of scale.
A bit like Singapore, then.
Yeah, a bit like Singapore,
okay.
Right? In Singapore,
a lot of smart people.
5 million people.
Yeah, 5.5.
Yeah.
It's finite.
Yeah, finite. Yeah. They don't have scale.
Going back to China, with the advent of AI, how do you think the speed of new ideas creation is going to be impacted?
I think the speed of new ideas...
you can get AI to create a paper, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, but I think ideas still come from people. It's the acceleration from an idea to something useful that AI will be able to help with. The ideas still come from people, but today there are a lot of barriers and times and efforts required to bring some idea to fruition. Perhaps the advent of AI would shorten that life cycle, but the ideas still come from people, I believe. Now, AI would really help with the US and more advanced countries to get back into the game of manufacturing. Let me explain why. I mentioned earlier that the cost of human capital you cannot ignore it. The differential is there because of the standards of living and so on and so forth. It's there. Now, with AI and robotics, we should be able to make a lot of progress in advanced manufacturing, because in advanced manufacturing, you need many high-skilled people, because those manufacturings are so complex. It's not like repeatedly doing things over and over again according to a recipe. You need to be able to understand the process, improve on it, and those require high-skilled people, highly educated people. Now, the developed world have a very high cost for human capital. That being the case, you want to make really good use of those people. Those productivity has to be much higher, and the advent of AI, robotics would allow developed countries to deploy these highly skilled people much more effectively than before. And so using that would allow us to level the playing field a little bit about the cost of high-skilled labor.
In the next 10 to 20 years, how do you see the landscape of the competition? In terms of countries, I mean, I think China is definitely pouring a lot more money onto this. The United States seems to be wanting to put more money onto this, not just on the IP side, but also on the manufacturing side. Mm-hmm. Korea seems to be very tenacious, right? How do you see the landscape?
It's
a bit like a Sputnik moment.
Yes.
From a chip standpoint.
Yeah. And not only chip, but many technology as well.
Right.
Many other technologies you can think about, like, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. They're all like that, right? So the world is becoming a little bit, the world of manufacturing or technology becomes a little bit more polarized, right? So you kind of separate into two camps or 2.5 camps and things like that. Right. And people some countries will need to play both sides and find their way around. But generally speaking, we think of it as two camps, right? Now, that being the case, then, as I mentioned earlier, for technology to advance, you really need open science. You need collaboration. So now, being that there are two camps, they don't talk to each other, that means things are going to go slower. What does that mean? That means the society going to benefit less because things are going to go slower. All right. Second is the separation of the supply chain. Costs will go up. Right? You need to find your suppliers, not the lowest bidders, but thinking about geopolitical situation, so cost is going to go up. Now, the question is, who's going to absorb those costs? And it's not clear who's going to absorb those costs. And today, if you look at, in part, why manufacturing in the US is such a bad situation today is, in part, I believe, I'm no economist, I'm just guessing. I'm an engineer, right? So and maybe an economist listening to this podcast would say, wait a minute, what's this guy talking about, right? But my guess is that the distribution of profits is not equitable across the entire chain. The companies who are operating at the top of the food chain, they glean most of the profits. I'll give you an example. I was just at Western Digital the other day, and they told me that if you want to buy iPhone with more storage, they charge you $100 or $300 more. But the people who make the chips to make it happen get a few dollars. So
you were talking about level playing field,
right?
There's not a lot of equity there.
There's a lot of equity there, right? So this situation needs to be corrected. Otherwise, the manufacturing in the U.S. is not going to go well. I remember, for example, we talk about talent, right? I was once in a panel discussion with a bunch of semiconductor companies, and one person from company lamented that, we couldn't hire people. There's nobody wants to join my company. We have positions we need to fill and so on and so forth. Lack of talent, lack of workforce. So I asked him, how much do you pay them? And he went silent. He couldn't answer my question.
Wow.
Why? Because they couldn't pay them to compete with the other people who reaps the profit, right? And because they couldn't pay them, they couldn't get enough profits, so that's why they couldn't pay them, and so they couldn't hire the people.
So this scarcity of talent is really structural.
It is structural. Right? It's not so much. A lot of people thought that, we just need to tell the universities to offer more courses. No.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. You need to have the demand. I could offer 10 courses, but if nobody takes my course, it wouldn't help you at all, right? You need to have the demand from the students. And where do you get the demand from the students? The students need to know that they have a bright career in front of them if they take these courses. If they go into this field, they will have a good career. Today is not the case for many of these manufacturing related jobs.
So you're suggesting, if I get you correctly, there's likely to be a deceleration of the competition by way of the polarization.
If we haven't managed it right.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll manage it better, right? And also the scarcity of talent.
A scarcity of talent.
I think it applies on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Right? The scarcity of talent.
It's not just on this side of the Pacific. I think it's on the other side of the Pacific too.
Exactly.
Given the scale, of course.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And that has to do with how the profits are fairly shared.
Right.
Because the companies who are doing the manufacturing and all the things below in the supply chain are not getting enough profits to offer good compensation, to offer good working environments to the employees.
So even within the supply chain, there's some players that are actually making disproportionately more than the other.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
That's a structural impediment.
Yeah, it is.
To the desired speed with which you want to move.
It is. I think the policy makers and economists has to recognize that. Otherwise, it's structural.
The aspiration to onshore in the U.S., there's been some conversations, discussions, and initiatives for TSMC to build a plant here and there in the U.S., including in Arizona. Do you see that moving smoothly or as smoothly as aspired? Or
Well, I was at this big conference in December. I told you earlier, a few speakers conference. I saw all my colleagues from around the world, from Europe and Japan and so on. My Japanese friends are all laughing at us. You guys are the slowest.
Okay, that's public knowledge, I guess. Wow. Now, talk about, there's the logic chips, there's the memory chips, and there's the special chips, right? We call it discrete or whatever. How will that fare going forward in terms of who's going to be more dominant than the others within each one of those three categories?
I think those three categories, they're all important. Okay. It's not like one is more important than the other. It's more important. Like, for example, we're doing this podcast, right? You need computers to crunch the data and stream the thing out.
Oh, and to store it too, somewhere.
Yeah.
Up in the clouds.
You need storage to store it, right? Yeah. And the microphones, the video cameras, they all made of chips. Those are specialty chips, right? So they're all important. Right? And so we couldn't say, oh, we can do without one of them. No, we cannot. They're all important. Now, as far as resources goes, as of today, the development of logic chips requires the most of the resources, because they are the ones who are driving in our kind of industry's parlance. It's the technology driver. The requirements drive the development of new technology, new equipment, new processes, new materials, new devices, new design. Those applications drive with AI, it drives big computers that can crunch these numbers for the AI models. And it also drives the development of computing chips that are so energy efficient. You can do things on the edge, what they call the edge of the internet. Right? You go buy a VR, AR headset today, you have to have a battery pack to come with it. And it's not the end state of VR, AR headset. I'm pretty sure about that. Right? In the final analysis, VR, AR headset is not going to operate like that. Yeah. But this is kind of like the intermediate stage that you need to go through. Just like cell phones used to be like size of a brick. Yeah. Right? And
I remember those.
You remember those, right?
In the early 90s.
In the early 90s, right? And those can only make a call and cannot do anything else.
Right.
And I will tell you a story. When I was at IBM, I used to work on image sensors. And in the mid 90s, I had an idea. I filed an invention disclosure about putting a camera on a phone, on a cell phone.
This was in the 90s, right?
It was in the 90s. And the IBM lawyers said, who wants a camera with a phone? We're not filing this
Say no more.
So, after like months, I finally convinced them to file it. And we do have a patent on that.
They had a great ability of prognosticating about the future.
Right. So all these things, all the progress that we desire the chips to have, we desire the chips to have these capability today is driven by computing means. But it doesn't mean that it will continue to be the case. It doesn't mean that. And also it doesn't mean that there's no real need for innovation in other places. For example, just take image sensor, for example. Tremendous innovation in image sensor. and they offer new capability in VR headsets. You need to have new innovations in image sensor and the way they receive the signal, convert it, and do processing right up front, not right at the sensor end, and not back in the mainframe computer. So all these innovation needs to happen in order to kind of satisfy our society's demand for technology in general. If you look at, for example, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, I basically go through all of them and say, hey, at least 12, 13 of them require advances in computing technology and chips technology in general. So without those, all those development goals will be severely curtailed.
The backers of all these are consisting of the designers and the manufacturers, right?
Yes.
Now, the Qualcomms of the world, the NVIDIAs of the world, they seem to be content with just designing, right? How do you see the progression going forward, or the shifting going forward? Are you likely, or are we likely to see them moving in the direction of manufacturing, given the complications or potential complications that we might see in the context of this polarization?
Wonderful observation. 30-some years ago, when Morris Chang came up with this split between fabless, namely companies that only design and do not have any factory for building chips, and foundries focus on building chips and not designing anything, that demarcation, that split, caused a blossoming of design activities, because people who design do not need to own the capital and all the baggage of owning a factory. And so they could then specialize on doing design. At the same time, people who own the factory can specialize on running the factory, and also having the benefits of having zillions of customers instead of one customer. If I manufacture my chip, I sell my chips directly to the customer, then I need not only one customer, that's myself. That's not enough to have scale, to have this economy of scale for the manufacturing. So this split has really blossomed in terms of making the design ideas go a lot faster than before, and created a lot of business opportunity that did not exist before. Because previously you have to have tremendous capital investment before you can design your own chip. Now you don't. You just have to design, and somebody will make it. Now that split has gone on really well for the last 30-some years. But today, if you look at the fabless and the foundry, they're not really split. They're actually together. Companies like Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, they show up at the foundries every day. They tell the foundry, hey, run this wafer, try this experiment, show me the results, give me the wafers so I can test it myself. So they are actually doing a lot of the development work of the chip itself. So the leading edge technology basically are today co-developed between the foundry and the leading user. Whoever placed the largest order have a big say in how the technology is going to be designed and optimized.
But what about skin on a game, though, in terms of manufacturing capabilities? Are they likely to put more skin on it?
It seems to be the case. There are indicators in there already. For example, Sony put in money in Japan and kind of work with, collaborate with TSMC to build a factory. In Europe, the collection of automobile companies putting their money down to build a factory there. So you're seeing some of that. And how far it will go is not clear, but you beginning to see some of that.
Talk about this company in Amsterdam or in Netherlands, ASML. They make a pretty fancy technology, right? Ultraviolet lithography.
Yeah.
That's well needed for a bunch of things, right? Talk about that.
Oh, that's history. A technology marvel. If you go into the details of how this machine, the EUV machine, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machine, is really an engineering marvel. Now, it is also a statement about two things. One, it's a statement about a global supply chain. The laser come from San Diego. The lens is polished in Germany. The mechanical movement came from Connecticut. So it's not just the Netherlands. It's a global supply chain of not only the machine parts itself, but also the knowledge, a global supply chain of knowledge. That's one. The other one is an example of open science. The first EUV papers were published in the late 80s by a group at Bell Labs, and then followed by a bunch of conferences in which researchers in Japan and in Europe all participated. And those formed and then the US national labs participated in the development of the early prototypes in the Department of Energy, the national labs. All these, and then companies start coming in, Intel, TSMC, and so on, and start investing. And we're talking about global companies, right, not just one country, global companies investing in it. And years later, 30-some years later, or maybe 40-some years later, you have this wonderful machine. And that's all coming from a global collaboration of researchers, generating knowledge, sharing the knowledge, and bootstrapping from themselves. And that's a very important lesson for us to learn, is that if you cordon yourself off from the rest of the world, you wouldn't be able to achieve that. Or even if you are able to do that, it will take a much longer time, and you lose the window of opportunity. That's a very important lesson to learn in this day of age of geopolitical tension, and everybody wants to kind of have everything to themselves and not sharing with each other. If you don't share, you don't gain. You gain back more than we share. I think that's basically how I would characterize it.
You breed a sense of optimism just by way of how the intertwining of different stakeholders in multiple countries. You seem to suggest that serves as a structural cohesive force for that to be it's very difficult to rip it apart.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And if you do rip it apart, you lose.
Everybody loses.
Everybody loses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody loses.
But, given the fact that we're seeing so much political neurosis in many parts of the world, yes, right? Sometimes people don't act rationally.
Yes.
They act based on what their heart tells you, not what their brain tells you. Isn't that a risk?
Yes, there's a risk. I think in some parts, I think it's due to the lack of understanding rather than any bad intent. It's not because somebody's bad intention or anything like that, but I think it's more like a lack of understanding. I came to that observation through my participation in a study from the Hoover Institution about 2 years ago. They had a study about U.S., China, Taiwan, and semiconductors. And they published, after 2 years, they published a report called Silicon Triangle. You can go on the Hoover website and download it. And through that participation, I understand, my observation is that many of the people in the policy circle they don't understand the technology.
Yeah.
Therefore, because of this lack of understanding, they would make policy that really doesn't make sense from a technology. If you do have this technology underpinning, it doesn't make sense. Now, it doesn't mean that the people making policy meant bad or anything like that. It's just a lack of understanding. And it also doesn't mean that the people making policy are dumb or anything like that. It's not. Nobody understands everything under the world, right? Today, they may be making policy about the pandemic, and tomorrow they may be making policy for semiconductor chips, and the next day maybe nuclear arms, right? So there's no way anybody, any single person or even a group of persons can understand everything under the world, right? But I think policymaking would really be helped if there are more people who have domain expertise are participating in the formulation of the policy. And today, I think we have very few people who understand, at least in the semiconductor space that I'm familiar with, who are materially participating in the formulation of the policies. And I think that is a big hole that we need to fill.
Do you suggest a higher degree of cultural interaction?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? I get the sense that people are not spending enough time in each other's places.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Like I said, I was participating in this Hoover study. Many of them are policy people, China experts, and so on. And at the end of the study, we all understand a little bit more about what the other people are experts about. I didn't know anything about China policy or industrial policy before, but I have at least some introductory understanding about it by now. And my colleagues likewise have some introductory understanding about semiconductors. They wouldn't ask the question, why not a full conductor anymore?
I had to ask you that. and I gotta ask you, what's the difference between oil and chips? I know you've been asked that. What's the difference between oil and chips?
What's the difference between oil and chips? Yeah, that's right.
I mean, people have been saying chips is the new oil.
Yeah. So I participated in this Hoover Institution study, and a lot of people say, chips, we need chips, and chips are everywhere. Anything that you need to turn on the power, have a battery in it, or plug into a wall, involve some kind of a chips. You roll up your car window, there's a chip. You listen to a podcast, you need a chip. Everything is a chip. So it's like commodity. It's like oil. We need oil. We need fossil fuel, right? So people make a comparison between oil and chips, and that comparison is pretty prevalent in a policy circle.
Right.
Okay. Now,
but it's misplaced.
I think it's totally misplaced. And when I made that comment at the study, and people look at me and say, "Oh yeah, okay, why is it different?" Chips are a lot like oil because oil has been in the ground for millions of years. It never change. You dig it up today, you dig it up tomorrow, it's the same oil. The method of digging may be different, but the oil is the same. Chips are not. You have phones, you have watches, you have your TVs. Would you like to use a phone that was made 20 years ago? Would you like to watch a TV that was made 20 years ago? You don't, because chips constantly advance, and it has to constantly advance to show its value. People expect chips to continuously advance in its capability. Capability broadly defined as in among the things, the kind of things that they can do, and also energy efficiency. Don't burn up so much energy or power. Don't use up that much battery power, and so on. So the chips is useful to us because it's valuable to us because it advances constantly. It constantly renews itself. Chips today is different from chips tomorrow. You want the chips tomorrow, not the chips of yesterday. Now, oil, it's not the same. You can stockpile oil, no doubt, and America does that. Many countries do that too. You don't stockpile chips. A stockpile that you have is not useful very soon.
Every couple of years, they're going to be obsolete.
Yeah, every couple of years, obsolete. Yeah, exactly.
Is it feasible to attain chip sovereignty or an absolute chip sovereignty?
Given the nature that we just talked about, the global nature.
I know, I'm imagining.
It's not possible. It's not possible. I think whoever suggests that in a policy circle is probably not having enough understanding about how the thing works.
Then I got to ask you the following question. In the worst case scenario, where we're seeing some unintended consequence or episode, happening in the Taiwan Straits, what would happen?
Well, let me quote two sources. One, according to a McKinsey report, it will be worse than the pandemic economically. Second, you probably have seen the interview on TV of the TSMC chairman, Mark Liu. Question was posed to him by the reporter. And I would like to quote his response. Say, if such a thing happened, you have more things to worry about than just chips. Just make sure that it doesn't happen.
I'll pray.
Let's make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, we've talked a lot. Any final messages, Philip, to people in Southeast Asia or anywhere around the world so that they can feel more optimistic about their becoming much more, positive and constructive about attaining STEM capabilities, hopefully some sort of manufacturing capabilities too, and being able to be collaborative with the rest of the world and all that?
Well, one of the things that turned out to be a positive thing for kind of developing countries or countries who are interested in advanced manufacturing, generally speaking, not just chips, but advanced manufacturing, is that because of the renewed sense of sensitization to supply chain resiliencies and so on, there is more of a diversification effort going on right now, that these countries who are historical in the past haven't really participated in this space have a great opportunity right now. And that means they need to be prepared to take this opportunity that is opening up to them. And that means, taking from the Taiwan experience that I mentioned to you that we discussed earlier, that means talent cultivation and government policy to support it, and general society, local society to support it. In terms of talent, by the way, a lot of people talk about workforce development.
Yep.
I actually don't like that word that much. I like to call it talent cultivation, because it's really talent, not just workers who repeatedly do the same thing, but really people who can continually learn and try do new things and understand the things, what they're doing, and be able to improve on it. Those are what talent would do, right? Not just generally workforce in the traditional sense of the word. And the other aspect is this general society support of the industry. I'll give you another interesting story. TSMC wanted to build a new factory in Hsinchu, in the place where they have a lot of factories. And the government zoned a piece of land for them. Unfortunately, there is a temple, a historical temple in that piece of land. I read about this in the newspaper. So And of course, tempo is sacred, and nobody wants to move the tempo. But then at the end of the day, they decided that, okay, I can relocate the tempo for you. That's an important statement about how the general society support the economic development.
They know where the priorities are.
They know where the priorities are, right? And that's a really strong statement to support the society.
Let me ask you, with the benefit of hindsight, if there wasn't a meeting between Morris Chang and a public official who had the authority and also the vision, well, both of them had a vision, right? Would there be a TSMC?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I mean, history developed the way it is because of certain events, certain people, right?
It's serendipitous.
Yeah. It's really, there's a Chinese saying that whether it's the situation that created the hero or the hero that created the situation, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of both. Right. Even if there is an official who started a conversation with a certain person, if that person is not astute enough, then nothing's going to happen. Or if there's a very visionary person, but there's no corresponding government official who sees things the same way, nothing's going to happen. I think it's a little bit of both. And I think it's a little bit of both. And earlier you asked about any lessons about Southeast Asian countries. I think there's also a lesson to be learned in the U.S. as well. In the U.S., we talk about onshoring manufacturing. To me, it sounded like giving a fish to somebody.
Yeah.
You haven't taught them how to fish.
Yeah. I agree.
Right, and that's important to understand. And the other thing is manufacturing and innovation or R&D, research and development, go hand in hand. Manufacturing is not just doing repeatedly the same thing to a recipe. There's a lot of innovation on the manufacturing floor. How to improve on the manufacturing process, how do you get better yield, how do you turn the current generation of technology a little bit better so that you can offer a newer version of this technology based on this current one. Just slight change, not big change, but slight change that provide value to your customer. How do you do that? And TSMC does that a lot. Every generation, they will come up with innovation on the manufacturing floor that turn it into a product that's slightly better than the previous one, that brings the customer in. You can tell the customer, hey, for a small price increase, you could get much better performance or energy efficiency or better cost that doesn't require you to go to the next jump. That's value to the customer.
Yeah.
So the manufacturing and research and development and innovation really go hand in hand.
Yeah.
That's one piece, one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that research and development has to be really close to manufacturing. Otherwise, you're dreaming up with solutions that not manufacturable. And how do you know what is manufacturable or not?
Yeah.
By being very close to the manufacturing floor. So in other words, it is very difficult to have the research and development divorced from the manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so if we just say, hey, Company X, just come to Ohio, Arizona, Texas, whatever, and build your fab. That's, I think, just basically isolate that so-called manufacturing from the rest of it. It's not going to be successful.
You got to be cognizant of the inseparability
of
the two components. Those are two sides of the same coin.
Those are two sides of the same coin. You cannot just say, I only bring manufacturing onshore and I don't do the R&D, and that's very important. So in other words, all these chips subsidies of $52 billion of
the
CHIPS Act, right? $39 billion goes to the manufacturing subsidies and $11 billion go to R&D.
Should be flipped.
Well, it may not be flipped because it takes more money to do the manufacturing, but the importance of which is flipped.
The R&D.
The most important one is the $11 billion.
I agree.
If you do that part right, I'm saying that not because I'm an academic, I do research, right? But if you don't do
I would
this
even
right,
put a greater number for R&D.
Exactly.
Than 11.
Right. That has to be done right. Otherwise, you'll get a fish and you ate that fish and then that's it.
You got to teach the fishermen how to fish.
Absolutely. And I think that is the most important thing. And for the fishermen to be successful, you need to be able to talk to other fishermen.
Yeah.
Where, so that you know where the fish is.
Yeah. And you got to have a boat.
Yes. You got to have a boat, yes.
There has been a lot of rhetoric about friendshoring, reshoring, offshoring, right? In the last few years. But if you take a look at the empirical evidence, call it Southeast Asia, capital formation hasn't really moved up in a meaningful manner. And I would speculate or even hypothesize that a lot of that is because of the lack of investment on a human capital, right? And the onus is really upon us to get our act together. There is a desire to reshore. There is a desire to relocate. But if we're not ready, it's not going to come.
Yeah. Well,
and it hasn't come as much as we would have hoped for.
Yeah, to capture the opportunity, you need to be prepared. And this talent cultivation is really to be prepared. You look at China as an example. They graduate more engineers than anybody in the world.
Yeah.
And that's how they becomes a manufacturing hub of the world. And to go to Shenzhen, it's unbelievable. If you want to build something, some hardware, you got to be there.
Yeah.
They have not only the people, but also the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the people is really amazing. They know how to do things. And so you need that investment.
Great dragon breaks ancient streets, paving change with modern beats. Cities rise and towers peak, new dawn breaking bold and sleek.
大家好，欢迎来到我们的六度探索节目。今天我们要探讨的是一个关于中国地方政府融资平台的复杂话题。朱镕基签下秘密交易，陈元制造金融假象，温家宝将祸水引向地方政府，形成了一场无法扑灭的地狱之火。这些事件如何交织？谁将成为中国土地金融悲剧的首要罪犯？我们将深入分析财政改革的第二轮，特别是2014年国家预算法框架的变化，如何影响地方政府的隐性债务。地方政府在新规则下被赋予了将隐性债务转为预算内债务的任务。然而，改革并未达到预期效果。LGFV 债务依然积累，地方官员的经济激励也未改变，中央政府的政策也并非一贯，一方面试图控制 LGFV， 另一方面又在需要时鼓励其增长。这种矛盾的政策导致地方政府在中央政府的不同政策之间进行对策。在这样的背景下， LGFV 的未来依然模糊不清。新的审计和监管政策是否能真正解决问题，还是会有新的融资来源出现？地方官员是否会继续依赖 LGFV 来驱动地方经济？这些问题都需要我们进一步探讨。请大家继续收看详细内容。朱镕基签下秘密交易，陈元制造金融假象，温家宝祸水引向地方政府，一场无法扑灭的地狱之火。谁是中国土地金融悲剧首罪？乍一看，仿佛是一场金融惊悚片的标题，但实际上， 这是中国地方政府融资平台兴衰的真实背景。想象一下，金融界的权力的游戏，每一位玩家都在寻找他们的铁王座，而最终只有债务火山爆发。故事的开始可以追溯到1990年代末，当时中国的财政改革正如火如荼地进行。是谁签下了秘密交易？当然是朱镕基。他在1998年担任国务院总理时，推动了一系列影响深远的改革。朱镕基就像一个厨房里的厨师，用一把锋利的刀剁碎旧的财政体系，试图为地方政府提供更多的自主权和资金来源。然而，虽然他的目的是好的，但他的刀痕却在地方政府的财政管理中留下了一个巨大的漏洞。这个漏洞被地方政府利用来创建了 LGFV。 这些平台成了地方政府的万能宝贝，他们借助银行贷款和发行债券为地方基础设施建设筹集资金。最初，这看起来像是个聪明的解决方案，毕竟谁不喜欢又快又大的桥梁、道路和高楼大厦呢？然而，问题在于，这些资金大部分来自银行贷款，而这些贷款并没有严格的审查和监管。朱镕基的继任者温家宝似乎对 LGFV 的风险视而不见，甚至在全球金融危机爆发后，通过一系列刺激计划，进一步扩大了 LGFV 的规模。温家宝就像是个心急的消防员，用大量的贷款来扑灭经济下滑的火焰，却没想到这些贷款最终变成了新一轮的债务火山。在这一过程中，陈元这个金融魔术师也扮演了重要角色。他通过复杂的金融操作和创新，使 LGFV 的债务问题看起来没那么严重。但真实情况是， LGFV 的债务在悄悄积累。2010年，中央政府意识到了问题的严重性，出台了限制银行对 LGFV 贷款的法规，就像是在一场火灾中试图用一个水管来控制蔓延的火焰。然而，火势太大，这些措施只不过是杯水车薪。2014年，国家预算框架进行了第二次重大变化，目的是处理预算外的 LGFV 债务。新的预算法给地方政府提供了一条清晰的路径，将 LGFV 的隐性债务转为预算内债务。这听起来像是一个妙计，但在实际操作中，这个计划却遇到了重重阻碍。首先，关于如何分类这些债务，北京和地方政府之间存在很大的分歧，结果许多债务并没有被成功转移。根据国际货币基金组织的估计，2018年 LGFV 的债务占中国 GDP 的 13.4%， 这可是个不小的数字。其次，新债券融资机制基本上与旧机制没有太大区别，唯一的不同是，这次北京更加积极地使用它。所有债券发行必须经过中央政府的批准，然后由省政府负责发行债务，并将收益分配给下级政府。这一机制虽然控制了潜在的肆无忌惮的低级行为，但也产生了巨大的协调问题。上级政府可能不知道下级政府正需要什么，而下级政府可能有动机不完全披露他们的需求。更重要的是，地方发展的激励没有改变，地方官员仍然高度参与经济，仍然控制地方银行和银子机构，继续从信贷流向 LGFV 中受益。因此，新的借贷并没有停止， LGFV 的债务继续积累。正如一句老话所说，上有政策，下有对策。地方政府在应对中央政府政策时，总能找到破解密码的办法。LGFV 的火焰在中央的限制下稍微减弱了一些，但地方政府总能找到新的燃料，使其再次旺盛。让我们来看看2014年的重大预算法变化后，北京的政策反复如何影响 LGFV 的发展。在2013年，国务院再次要求地方政府增加基础设施投资。然后，不久之后的2014年，在重大预算法变更后，北京发布了第40号文件，反过来又敦促金融机构继续向 LGFV 提供贷款。这种政策的反转显示出中央和地方政府之间的一种斗智斗勇的游戏。到了2018年，国务院明确表示，政府的目标是在2017年数据基础上，在5到10年内消除所有地方政府的隐性债务。然而， LGFV 的问题并没有因此消失。地方政府通过多元化持股、混合资产和债务等策略，继续保持信贷流动和运营能力。LGFV 的复杂性和债务负担只会增加，而地方政府的角色和任务依然广泛。新的融资来源是否会出现，还是他们将被迫放弃？在2018年后，一些政策文件不再公开发布，而是内部流传。这种秘密操作使得外界很难了解具体的政策变化和实施情况。即便如此，在中国内部的讨论仍然非常活跃。一家专注于地方政府和国有企业的资产管理公司南京机智远建议，如果一个地区的城市投资平台资质较弱，融资能力下降，可以考虑注入优质资产，整合弱平台资产，或者收购优质上市公司，以拓宽融资渠道。实际上，处理 LGFV 债务问题的政策效果充其量值得怀疑。地方政府仍然高度依赖 LGFV 来推动地方经济发展和完成政府任务。正如经济学家蓝小欢在其著作《置身事内》中所说，政府债务问题的根本原因不是收入不足，而是支出过多，因为政府在发展经济方面承担了太多角色。LGFV 的存在正是这个问题的体现。尽管中央政府多次尝试约束 LGFV 的债务增长，但地方政府总能找到新方法继续借款和投资。LGFV 的未来依然模糊，他们可能会继续存在，直到中央政府找到一种更深层次的改革方法来彻底解决这一问题。毕竟，要真正解决 LGFV 的问题，需要的不仅是政策和法规的调整，更需要对整个系统进行更深层次的改革。而对于朱镕基、陈元和温家宝这些金融大佬来说，他们的角色正如金融界的战士，在这场金融减债的战役中，各自发挥了不同的作用。究竟谁是中国土地金融悲剧的首罪？这恐怕是一个没有简单答案的问题。也许这场金融悲剧的首罪不是某一个人，而是整个系统在快速发展中留下的缺陷。正如一句老话所说，种瓜得瓜，种豆得豆，种下的因最终却结出了今天的果。无论如何， LGFV 的故事还在继续，债务的火焰也还在燃烧。未来的中国如何在这场无法扑灭的地狱之火中找到出路，仍然是一个巨大的挑战。为了实现更美好的生活和高质量的发展，中国或许需要一次更彻底的制度变革，把刀转向内，刮骨去毒。地方融资平台的债务黑洞，中国经济复苏的致命吸引力。北京的新一届政府正在忙得不可开交，试图推动经济复苏，就像一位过度工作的咖啡师试图在早高峰期间满足所有顾客的需求。然而，眼前的挑战却像是一杯被打翻的焦炭咖啡，更不幸的是，牛奶已经泼在了地上。地方融资平台的债务黑洞无疑成为了中国经济复苏路上的拦路虎。根据路透社的最新分析数据，中国地方政府的债务已经高达惊人的9万多亿美元，而且这个数字还在不断增长。今年，地方政府通过融资平台即将到期的海外债券金额已飙升至7900亿美元，创下自2021年以来的最高水平。这些债务不但让地方官员寝食难安，还让全球投资者如坐针毡。国际信誉评级机构惠誉国际指出，地方政府的债务扩展速度已经超过了他们的收入增长速度，犹如一场不见底的金融黑洞。香港南华早报也对这一现象表示担忧，特别是因为去年全国大部分城市在疫情动态清零政策中被封城，无休止的核酸检测和方舱医院的建设耗尽了地方政府的财政收入。这些地方政府现在不得不靠向银行要求债务展期和下调贷款利息来拖延违约，仿佛是一场旷日持久的债务拖延大赛。东方资本研究院的创始人兼董事总经理安德鲁·科利尔指出，地方融资平台已经成为中国金融系统的黑洞，这一点形象的如同一位无底洞的吃货，永远填不满。地方政府现在的财政收入几乎为零，根本无法偿还所欠债务。 科里尔表示，我预计许多地方融资平台都会崩溃，银行或许会悄悄重新注资，使一些农业银行和债券持有者面临违约的风险。另一边，牛津经济学院的高级经济学家卢兹惠却提出了一些令人稍感安慰的预期。他估计，北京中央政府今年给地方政府的转移支付将比去年增加 3.6%， 这一举措无异于将一根救命稻草递给了那些濒临破产的地方财政部门。转移支付，简而言之，就是中央政府将自己的财政收入的一部分转移给地方政府，仿佛是在重新分配一张大披萨，以缓解地方政府的财政困难。尽管如此，这一切仍然无法掩盖地方政府债务对整个经济体系的深远影响。国际货币基金组织上个月公布的数据显示，中国地方融资平台的债务总额已经从去年的57万亿猛增至66万亿元人民币，占中国这个世界第2大经济体的一半。土地收入的急剧下降以及新的融资渠道的减少，让地方政府如坐针毡，对整个银行业和市场的影响更是深远。南华早报引用日本投行野村证券的分析师的话说，北京这次将经济增长目标设定在 5%， 实际上是给自己留有余地，来解决地方政府债台高筑所带来的挑战。也就是说，北京的工作重点即将转向，或许在某个时间点上，当经济复苏大体稳定后，北京将解决地方政府的金融风险和隐性债务问题。尽管中国政府正在努力通过增加基础设施建设开支来推动经济复苏，但地方政府的债务却如同一颗定时炸弹，随时可能爆炸。这一问题不仅仅是中国政府需要面对的难题，也对全球经济产生了深远的影响。中央政府的救助计划是否能够解决这个金融黑洞，仍然是一个悬而未决的问题。不过，可以确定的是，这场债务危机比我们想象的要复杂得多，复杂的仿佛是一本没有结局的侦探小说。
请大家继续收看节目第6度百科，对关键内容进行背景介绍。朱镕基 1928年10月23日是中国著名的政治家和经济学家，曾任中华人民共和国国务院总理。1998至2003年，他以其在经济改革和治理腐败方面的强硬态度而闻名。朱镕基在1979年进入政府工作，曾担任国家纪委副主任、上海市市长等职务。在担任总理期间，他推动了一系列市场化改革，为中国经济的快速增长奠定了基础。此外，他还注重财政纪律、治理腐败、削减政府开支和改善金融体系。陈元 Chen Yuan 1945年1月是中国金融界的重要人物，曾任中国国家开发银行董事长。他是中国人民银行创始行长陈云的儿子。陈元在1988年加入国家开发银行，担任副行长，后升任行长、董事长。在其领导下，国家开发银行成为中国最大的政策性银行之一，资助了大量的基础设施和公共项目，为中国的经济发展做出了重要贡献。温家宝 Wen Jiabao 1942年9月15日是中国著名的政治家，曾任中华人民共和国国务院总理。2003至2013年，温家宝以其亲民形象和对社会问题的关注而受到广泛好评。他在总理任期内推动了多项重大政策，包括农村改革、医疗改革和教育改革。同时，他在应对2008年全球金融危机方面也表现出色，通过实施大规模经济刺激计划，帮助中国经济迅速恢复。温家宝还注重社会公平，致力于缩小城乡差距和解决贫困问题。
谢谢大家收看6度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体。网友与6度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的6博士提出你能想出的任何问题。6度世界网址是6du.world， 请介绍给